Here we go. For tonight, we're going to talk about guiding your team to technical excellence. And I'm going to share with you a short story about typically how I see teams go through agile transformations and or transition through phases of agile adoption, and see if any of these resonate with you. Typically what happens is I get called in. A CTO will basically say, hey, Friday, we've been doing Scrum for a while, but we're not really realizing the benefits that we were expecting. Can you come in and help out? And what I typically see is the team working in sprints, and they're doing 2-week sprints, which is awesome. So and typically teams struggle at first with 2-week sprints, but they're doing 2-week sprints. But then what I notice is that the first sprint is a requirement sprint. That is followed by a design sprint. That is followed by a coding sprint. And then we have a testing sprint. Now, maybe this is better than what we were doing before, but this is not really what we're aiming for here. We can see that finishing something is taking about 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks. So we're looking at 2 months here before we complete anything. And just because we're using the word sprints and we have a product owner and we're doing dailies, doesn't necessarily bring us closer to what Scrum is supposed to be about. So then we transition and we basically highlight that we have to do all of these activities in one single sprint. Now, doing them in a 2-week sprint is going to be hard, so we do a 1-month sprint. And what happens is the first couple of days we do requirements, then we spend another couple of days doing design, we spend most of the sprint doing coding, and then on the very last day, we do testing. Again, better, but we can see here that it's taking us about a month to finish something, right? It's still taking us about a month. And of course, the testing team's not happy here, all right? They're basically saying you can't spend most of your time coding and then dump everything at the end of the sprint and expect us to turn things around. So at this point, there's a better understanding in terms of how requirements and design work in Scrum. And the idea is that we progressively elaborate on our requirements and design. And it's an ongoing activity that's happening throughout in product backlog refinement. So now the focus is on coding and testing. So we're back to 2-week sprints. But now what we do is we code, and then we kind of have a parallel structure. We do a handoff to a testing team. So we have a testing sprint. And in parallel, we continue coding. And we kind of have the structure where a coding sprint will feed a testing sprint, and another coding sprint will feed another testing sprint, and so forth. If there are any problems that get discovered in testing, those get fed to the following sprint. So now what we're looking at is, these again, now we're back to 2-week sprints. So we're looking at anywhere between a month or maybe longer, depending on whether there were any errors or bugs discovered. So we're looking at a month or a month and a half to complete these stories. Maybe better than what we were doing before, but it's still not where we need to be. Typically what we want to get to is finishing up items in the sprint. So maybe the first couple of days, the first 3 or 4 days, we have an item complete. And by complete, we mean properly coded, properly designed, properly tested, and ready to go. And we proceed that way, where throughout the sprint, we are finishing things, and we're not waiting till the last day of the sprint to have everything done. This is what Scrum lets us do. This is how we start realizing the benefits of Scrum. This is how we get faster return on investment, how we become better able to respond to changing requirements and changing market conditions. This is how we reduce our risks. Yet this is hard, and many teams struggle with that. So what we're going to talk about today is what are the technical practices that will help us get there, and how to guide your team to start adopting these technical practices. So I'm Fadi Stefan. I'm a certified Scrum trainer and Agile coach. And I focus on helping organizations and teams transform, innovate, and deliver impactful products. Here's my contact info, and I'll put it in the chat a bit later if you want to continue this conversation offline. So let's kick off by asking, why can't we deliver a product increment at the end of the sprint? I'm going to ask you to fire up the chat and kind of give me your initial thoughts. Why do you think we can't deliver a product increment at the end of the sprint? What are we struggling with? Why is this hard? Why is this a struggle? Let's pull up the chat and let me see what you're thinking. Lack of cross-functional teams. Yeah, maybe. Items too big. Stories not defined properly. Yeah. Why can't we deliver a product increment? What challenges are teams facing so that we reach the end of the sprint and we can't deliver a product increment? Right? Maybe we don't have a roadmap. Technical debt, absolutely, technical debt. And dependencies. All right, reluctance to raise blockers or the idea around cross-functionality. Definition of done doesn't exist. Skills, infrastructure, dependencies. All right, that's good. Let me share with you a few things that I think are relevant. I've already seen some of them pop up here. Let me share with you a few of my thoughts. The very first one is misunderstanding of what a product increment really is. Right? A misunderstanding of what a product increment really means. And typically what happens is we start doing Scrum, but we're still working the same way. We're still working the same old way, and we basically are working in sprints, and we're delivering one item per sprint, and then we have a sprint where we put everything together. This is not what a product increment is. A product increment is whatever we've delivered previously, plus added functionality on top of that. Right? It's an increment, which includes whatever we've delivered previously, plus new functionality. Right? So there isn't this concept of build, then put everything together. You always have the latest version of your working product up and running, and you're always adding new stuff to it. Right? You're always adding new stuff to it. Now, keep in mind that we're building stuff iteratively and incrementally. And if you're just going through something once, you're not really iterating. And if you're not adding to what you already have, you're not really incrementing. And in Scrum, we build things iteratively and incrementally. And the product increment is whatever we had plus new functionality added on top. So there's this general misunderstanding of what a product increment is and the idea of making sure we always have a working version of our product up and running all the time. The second issue is lack of skills. Some people mentioned that in the chat. This is a new way of working, right? We are not used to working this way, and we don't necessarily have the right skills to be able to build products in this fashion. But hey, we go to training, we learn about the concept, but we don't build up the skills to be able to do that. So there's generally a lack of skills here from a development perspective in terms of how to develop in this fashion. And the problem kind of builds on itself. First, we have no problem sending product owners or Scrum Masters to training. That's not really a problem. It's one person. But sending an entire team has a big impact. We can't really send the entire team. We'll make up excuses. That's going to be having the team out for such an extended period of time has a big impact. So that's one. And then the other issue is that developers are not interested in this type of training of better ways of working. We're much more interested in learning about new technology. And if I'm going to have the opportunity to go to training, I want to learn about a new web framework. I want to learn about mobile development. I want to learn about cloud development. I'm not really interested in new ways of working. And this is kind of unfortunate because all of this movement actually started out from the perspective of developers and how to make their lives easier and how to help developers build better products. Now it's seen kind of as a management fad, and developers are generally not interested and want nothing to do with it. So we have this kind of problem of lack of skills in terms of how to build iteratively and incrementally. Siloed roles, we saw that also in the chat. So we're doing Scrum. but we are still siloed either by teams, meaning we have one team that does handoffs to another team, or between team members within the team, we regularly have handoffs. We don't have this concept of cross-functional teams that are capable of taking an idea from conception all the way to production. And that creates this added dependencies, creates this added handoffs. It creates, I don't know, very complicated planning and coordination that needs to happen, which further kind of delays. We have to see these bottlenecks that happen and further delays our ability to deliver at the end of the sprint. Quality is an afterthought. We're still in this mindset of build first, then check for quality later. So build first, then test. Whereas we want to kind of transition to building quality in. So from the beginning, we want to be thinking about building a quality product, not building it and then checking whether it's a quality product or not. So we're still in this staged or phased approach of build, then test. And there's generally a lack of automation, whether it's automated builds, automated tests, automated deployments, which tie in with that quality concept I just mentioned, making testing very long, painful, and fragile. So we reach the end of the sprint, and we don't have enough time to test or to deploy. All right. So I'm going to walk through a few agile engineering practices that will help with these issues. And then we'll talk about how can we get the team to kind of adopt them and what can we do to do that. Let's get started. So test-driven development is a key practice where we think about the problem we want to solve and we start out with a test. It's a very, very small test, and this is a failing test that we're going to run, and it's going to fail because there's no code yet. And then we go ahead and build the code. We build just enough code to make this test pass, and then we do a very important step, which is refactoring. When we're refactoring, we're cleaning up our code. We're making our implementation better, and we're ensuring that the test still passes. So we went from red to green. Red was failing, green was passing, and then we clean up our code, and all along the way, we ensure that the test is still passing. Right? Once we are happy with the implementation, we kind of move on, right? We kind of move on to our next little test, add some more code, clean it up, and move on from there. This approach is how we build stuff iteratively and incrementally. So it builds up these skills of building applications in small, little, iterative, and incremental steps. In addition, the notion of refactoring ensures that our code has a solid foundation, and we're building quality in. Right? So we're already approaching it from a quality perspective and thinking about quality ahead of time. A side effect is that we have a test suite. In fact, by the time we're done coding, we're done testing from a functional perspective in terms of proving that the code works as intended. So not only have we pushed quality and built it in, but we've also built a test suite that we can then hook up to our continuous integration server and run over and over again. So we have test automation, we have quality, we're building stuff iteratively and incrementally. And this one practice helps us tackle a lot of these issues that we highlighted earlier. Next up, pair programming. All right, pair programming is two developers working together side by side on the same problem. All right, two developers working together side by side on the same problem. Let's think about what does that help? How does that help? Well, it's going to help with the silos. We're going to share knowledge, and we'll break down the silos between the individuals. It's also going to push quality in, meaning instead of building something and then sending it for a code review at the end, once we're done with it, we're getting a code review from the very beginning. So we know we're building something of high quality, and we have two people working on it, so the design is going to be better. Plus, we've shared knowledge across different people on the team, which means we're slowly breaking down the silos between those team members. Now, when we talk about ensemble programming or mob programming, we're taking pairing and kind of dialing the knob off, turning it on to number 11, right? We're turning it all the way up. It's no longer sharing between two people. We're doing it with the team. As a team, we are now solving a problem together. We are cross-pollinating knowledge, and we are building up our quality all together, the quality of the product plus sharing domain knowledge, sharing technical knowledge across the team, which is, again, going to impact quality, have a direct impact on quality, and break down those silos that we talked about. And the final, not the final, one more, but collective code ownership is what this leads to. What collective code ownership allows us to do is that we're no longer dependent on one person. We no longer have to locally optimize our work based on who's available and what skills they have. Collective code ownership means the entire team owns the code. I'm not always going to go to Lisa for changes in the billing module, and I'm not always going to go to Matt for changing in the accounting module. Right? Having the team exposed to different modules of the application, now everybody has a comfort level to go in and make changes. They might not be able to go in and do heavy lifting, but they will be able to go in and make necessary changes where needed based on priority, not based on who's available and what skills do we have on the team. So it allows us to actually prioritize our work based on value, not based on team availability. Continuous integration and continuous deployment allows us to always have a working version of our product up and running. Whenever we make a change, it gets integrated to what was already there and gets deployed. So this allows us, again, to reinforce this concept of iterative and incremental development, where we always have the latest version of the application up and running all the time. Anytime somebody makes a change, that gets picked up and it gets deployed to some environments. All right, so those are the concepts that I'm going to focus on. There are many more, but these are the concepts that I'm going to focus on for today. Let me pause for a second. I think I saw a question in the chat. How does automation fit into TDD? That was the question. Well, test-driven development is helping us build out the application in a way that will be, what's the right word? In a way that we're building it with a solid foundation in place. And as a side effect, we have tests that prove that the application works. These tests now become part of our regression test suite. So we can run them over and over and over again later on, so that whenever we make changes, we ensure that everything else we had still works. Right? So typically, I kind of refer to the automation or the tests in test-driven development as a side effect of the technique. The technique is to enable us to build better code, to build things based on a solid foundation. And as a side effect or a side benefit, we now have tests that we can plug into our continuous integration server and have them run over and over and over again. That way, if we accidentally make a mistake somewhere, we're immediately alerted that we messed up and we need to fix it. All right, now why the pushback? All right, these practices came out of XP. XP was kind of invented in the late 90s. It's been 20 years these practices have been around. Yet many teams today still struggle with adopting these practices. So something here is wrong. People will say, oh, maybe XP or extreme programming is too hard, right? So, or it's too extreme. So I don't want to do extreme programming. I'm just going to do Scrum. And Scrum says nothing about adopting these practices, so we don't need to do them. Now, the interesting thing is what Scrum says is that you have to deliver a working product increment at the end of every sprint. It's true, it doesn't specifically call out these practices the way XP calls them out, but Scrum says you have to deliver a working product increment at the end of every sprint. So the question will become, if you can't, you're supposed to take that into your retrospective and figure out what practices do we need to apply so that we can do that. And there's no way you can deliver a product increment at the end of the sprint if you are not applying these practices. So that's typically how Scrum indirectly kind of encourages you to apply these practices, because you're supposed to pick the practices that will work for you so that you can deliver at a sustainable pace the product increment at the end of the sprint. All right. Now, let's see, why the pushback? What excuses have you heard as to why we can't do this stuff? Let's pull up the chat again. Let's see what excuses you've been dealing with or you've heard before about why the pushback. All right, wasting resources. Why have two people work on one thing? Prioritizing, we don't prioritize maintenance, right? So it's work done outside of the sprint. How do I know who to go to for questions, right? We're used to working in a serialized way. Teams don't understand why we're doing this. Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting, Adam. Yeah, we don't trust the automated test. We want to see it in our own eyes. Interesting. All right, a few more. All right, even in siloed groups, we have other dependencies. Sorry, even in cross-functional teams, we have other dependencies. All right, let me share with you a few reasons of why we get the pushbacks. I think they're all legitimate, and then we'll walk through how to go overcome them. All right. TDD is hard. All right. This practice is actually difficult to do. It takes how we're used to building things and flips it over. It is actually counterintuitive. Plus, I'm used to just coding and having somebody else test. Now you're asking me to not only code, but also to test something. So I'm not familiar with testing. Plus, I have to do testing. So it's going to take me so much longer to finish something up. Right? So we have these excuses that not only it's counterintuitive, but it also takes longer to do. Right? Pairing is uncomfortable. Right? It is actually exhausting. You are on and you are focused the whole time. You're pairing. All right? It's mentally draining. Plus, in the world where we could be around each other, it's somebody's in your space the whole time. All right, so it is not only mentally draining, but it's physically uncomfortable to have somebody sitting next to you for an extended period of time. So if we're not pairing properly, it's definitely uncomfortable. And if we don't have the right skill sets, TDD is definitely hard to proceed with. Collective code ownership is pretty much impossible. People will say, I have a hard enough time understanding the module that I'm working with on a day-to-day basis. How do you expect me, just from a domain perspective, forget from a technology perspective, how do you expect me to understand all these other parts of the application? Just focusing on one part is hard enough. So people will basically say, you know what, TDD is hard to do. Or not TDD, sorry, collective code ownership is impossible. For CI/CD, this one, there's a lot less pushback. People will say, oh, we already have Jenkins, right? CI/CD, not a problem. We've already used Jenkins. But what generally is happening is people are confusing the tool with the practice. All right? Jenkins is the tool. The question is, are you working off of the main line? How many branches do you have? How often are you integrating? That's what continuous integration is about. It's not about the tool. It's about continuously integrating our code base multiple times per day so that we always have a working version of our product. Just having Jenkins out there and not integrating doesn't really help. Moreover, not having a test suite that you're going to run every time you check something in doesn't really help either. So having the tool is, yes, it's one great step, but it's really more the practices that we care about, right? It's really the practices that we care about. So what we're going to chat about next is we're going to walk through 7 steps to kind of guide your team to adopt these practices and make them easier, right? Make them easier so that we can improve our quality, get to the point where we're actually delivering product increments at the end of the sprint. Some of these you'll be able to do on your own, even if you're not technical. Others, you're going to need a technical coach to come in and help with these practices. Let's walk through them. The first one is training. All right. Now, training, and this is going to be a shameless plug from my end. You need training like the certified Scrum developer training or the Agile Engineering Practices training, and particularly training that is hands-on programming. So 70% of my class is hands-on coding, where we're actually going through these practices. And it's not learning, basic silly exercises. We're actually learning how to build an application using these practices. Now, this is important for two reasons. One is to expose the team members to these practices. Yes, that is key. But the other one is to get this aha moment so that people truly understand how this is going to be beneficial. And typically in my classes, you see that typically on the second day. You see it on people's faces where they're, the first day we've run through a couple of concepts, we've done a few exercises, but it's not really gelling. And then by the second day, people start kind of getting it, right? There used to be, the Washington Post used to have if you don't get it, you don't get it slogan. This is kind of the same thing. So by the second day, you see that expression on people, and now they're thinking, okay, I get it. How will I apply it to my internal code base? How will I apply it internally to the way I work? So that is one thing, which is training. Now, the second thing, actually, before I move on to the second thing, I want to highlight how developers are supposed to be spending their time on Scrum teams, because this is, again, something very common that I see people miss out on. Now, typically, this is what happens. We send people to training, and then we expect them to work on building the product increment, right? So we send people to training, and then we expect them to spend most of their time building the product increment. Now, yes, building the product increment is what we're doing for most of the sprint. All right, we are doing that. However, on a day-to-day basis, as developers, we also need to be spending time doing product backlog refinement. This is a key activity that happens throughout the sprint. And as developers, we're not only working towards the goal of the current sprint and building the product increment, but we're also working on prepping for future sprints. And if you find yourselves always reaching the end of the sprint and then having to kind of push things over to the next sprint and push things over to the next sprint, it's more than likely that we are not spending enough time doing product backlog refinement and prepping for what's coming. So key activity here that needs to happen throughout the sprint. And then the other one is continuous improvement, right? Scrum is not going to magically solve your problems. Hey, we're doing Scrum, so everything's going to get better. That's not going to happen. What Scrum will do is it will put a spotlight on all your organizational and team dysfunctions. And then via continuous improvements, we will slowly solve these problems. And what this means is we need to dedicate time for continuous improvement. And that typically falls in two areas. One is retrospective action items that we're going to tackle as a team or as an organization to make things better. And the other one is what we refer to as T-shaped skill sets, which is the idea of expanding my expertise as an individual so that I can help in other areas. If I have deep back-end expertise, I will work on getting better in front end. I'm not going to become an expert, but I'm going to become functional, and vice versa. And if I have great front-end expertise, I will dabble in back-end coding so that I can become better. And it's going to vary depending on the skill sets on the team, but the idea is we're constantly improving our own individual skill sets as well as the team and organizational action items we're tackling from the retrospective. So are these split up equally? Probably not. They will vary depending on the maturity we're in. When we're first starting, we're going to be spending a lot more time doing product backlog refinement and doing continuous improvement initiatives than actually building the product increment. As we get better, those will shrink, and we'll be spending most of our time building the product increment. So typically, it might look something like this. Now, notice that it will never go down to zero, right? It's going to start up high, working on product backlog refinement to get our product backlog in shape, or continuous improvement initiatives. They're going to start up high, and they will slowly decrease over time, but they will never go down to zero. Typically, once you have your product backlog in good shape, you're spending about 10% of your time on product backlog refinement, and maybe another 10% of your time on continuous improvement. So anywhere between 20 to 30% of our time is spent on these two initiatives, and anywhere between 70 to 80% of our time is going to be spent on building the product increment. Again, this is going to vary based on context, but as the team matures, it's going to settle down at that kind of 80-20, 70-30 ratio. It'll be totally different in the early stages of coding. So keep this in mind, because there's no way we're going to improve, there's no way we're going to get better if we're not dedicating time to continuous improvement. So let's go back. And we talked about the first one is training. And I'm lumping here training in continuous improvement. And what I'm trying to highlight is you can't go from a training class to building product increments. It's just unrealistic expectations here. We have to kind of ease into it. And we're going to talk about how we're going to do that. First and foremost, somebody mentioned that in the chat again, you need a definition of done. Definition of done often gets confused with acceptance criteria. And those are two separate concepts. Acceptance criteria tells you when a requirement is complete. Definition of done is about our quality checklist. How do we as a team build a quality product? What is our definition of quality, right? And the way you're going to put it together is by actually asking the team. This is an example that you see on your screen, but you can ask the team, what are all the activities that we need to do to take the code that's sitting on your machine and put it all the way in production? Brainstorm together. What are all the activities needed? Think about all the different environments that you likely have to go through. Write them all down. Do I need to deploy to a test environment? Do I need to deploy to a staging environment? What type of testing do I need to do? What kind of approvals do I need? Whatever it is, each organization, each team, it's going to be different. Put that all out there. And then ask your team, from these, which ones can we do per product backlog item? And have the team decide, based on their context, based on their reality, what items can we do per product backlog item? Which means when I move a product increment from not done to done, which one of these items can I do as a quality checklist? Then the team will say, these other items are too expensive, too time consuming, too resource intensive to be able to do per product backlog item. So I can only do them per sprint. I'm going to wait and maybe do them on the last day of the sprint. And then these other items are even too expensive to be done once per sprint. And I'm going to wait and do them once every 6 sprints, or whatever that may be. All right. Now, this, the team might decide that, updating the help text is per sprint and not necessarily per release, and that's fine. This becomes our definition of done, and it's transparent and it's clear. And it's basically highlighting that based on our current constraints, based on our current reality, based on our current environment, we are not capable as a team, because of the stuff here, the stuff at the bottom, we're not capable as a team to deliver a product increment at the end of the sprint. If you like what you see, it's going to take us 2 weeks, 2 months, I don't know, however long these things take to complete before we can deliver a product increment to you. We make that transparent, we make that clear. However, this does not mean that it stays static. We have to start with our current reality, but we also have to improve. All right, what does that mean? It means every couple of retrospectives, maybe every 4 retrospectives or so, we pull up our definition of done and we work together as a team to figure out what items from the bottom we want to push up into the sprint. And slowly, right, this is not going to happen overnight, slowly we start moving items one by one, so that eventually we have nothing in the release section. And we're able to complete all of these activities within the sprint. Right? It's not going to happen overnight. This will take time. But we're using the definition of done, and we're using the retrospectives to continuously improve on them. Other teams might go even further and push stuff all the way up so that they have nothing in the sprint section. When you do that, now you're able to push things out multiple times per sprint, and even multiple times per day. All right? You should have that as a goal. You should have that on your roadmap if it makes sense for the products you're building. And know that we need to start where we currently are, right? This is aspirational. We're going to start where we are, and we're going to slowly get better until, at least at a minimum, we don't have anything in the release section, and everything, all of our quality checklists can be completed within the sprint. That should be the minimum that you want to aim for and you want to drive towards. All right, next up, dojos. Dojos are kind of dedicated learning hours, right? Dedicated learning hours. And they're needed because your production code base is likely messy. It's a big mess. And for a team to take concepts they just learned in training and start applying them to their production code base is unrealistic. So dojos are kind of deliberate practice exercises that reinforce concepts that were covered in training. And we're going to do that every day in a safe environment, right? It's 1 hour every day. We're going to practice and reinforce what we covered in training in a safe environment. And the idea here is to build up the skills that we learned in training. It's going to be pairing. It might be test-driven development. Each day will be a specific topic we're reinforcing. It might be design principles, right? It might be code smells. It might be legacy code. It might be refactoring. Each day we will cover specific topics and build up those skills. Now, what we're doing here is we're prepping for the future. When we run into these situations with our production code, we now have built up the skills to tackle our own production code. We have to do this practicing, all right? Now, sprint goal, very, very important. Cannot tell you how many teams I work with that don't have a sprint goal. And they're just a group of people sitting next to each other working on unrelated items, right? We need to be working together collaboratively. And I'm just going to quote from the Scrum guide. Each sprint should have a sprint goal. And this sprint goal should deliver a product increment that brings us closer to an overall product goal or an overall product vision, all right? And when we do that, we start having focus. People are working together on one thing, one higher level thing, and our goal is to deliver on the sprint goal, not on the individual items we're working on. Right? Once you do that, you start having this notion of collaboration versus people in their own little swim lanes. Very, very important to encourage everybody to have a sprint goal. For each sprint planning meeting, we have to have a sprint goal, and we have to pick product backlog items that build towards the sprint goal. And the goal no longer becomes, let's finish the product backlog items. It becomes, let's deliver on the goal. Let's bring us closer to our overall product goal, overall vision. Once we have that, we can start doing ensemble programming or mob programming. And this is going to be 2 hours per day. And we're going to do it mandatory. And this is going to be on your real production code. So the dojos was in a safe environment. This is on production code, but we're doing it collectively. And ideally, in sprint planning, you want to pick a suitable story to tackle collectively. And this would be a great candidate to do something vertically, meaning end-to-end vertical functionality, because we have the entire team working on this. So we will not need handoffs. We're going to work on it together and go end-to-end and learn from each other. All right? We're going to learn from each other. It's not only are we learning domain expertise, but technical expertise, design expertise. We're building all of that up while we start applying these practices we learn in training. All right. Then we're going to do pairing. Now, pairing is also going to be on production code, but it's going to be voluntary. Right? You don't want to force this. You want to have it voluntary. And again, in sprint planning, we want to pick ask for volunteers and pick stories that might be good candidates for working on them as a pair. Encourage a mix of skill sets, senior person with a more junior person, a mix of domain expertise, people that haven't worked in a particular area of the code, or a mix of technical expertise, right? You want to encourage this mix so that we have this transfer of knowledge and we further break down the silos. CI/CD, I think that's going to be the last topic I'm going to highlight. The key here is that this should be done by the team. This should not be outsourced to a separate team. All right, now, agility was all about bringing business and technology together. And when that grew, operations was left kind of behind. So DevOps came up, and the idea behind DevOps was to bring kind of IT and operations together. And that's why there's the word DevOps. It's about developers and operations folks working together. And what we have today is this notion of a DevOps team, which is completely contrary to what the idea of DevOps is all about. It's about people working together. And when you have this DevOps team, now you have a handoff from the development to the DevOps team. What we want to do is bring in those skill sets to the team, right? So you have to have the team own their pipelines. And if you don't have the expertise, bring in the expertise, but don't have them do it for you. This is about a transfer of knowledge. This is about the team owning what they're building. I'm not going to build and do a handoff. I'm going to build and maintain. I'm going to build, maintain, and run. Right? So what we want to do here is slowly have the team build out their pipelines and own them, not kind of delegate them or relegate them to some other team that just does that. And again, if you don't have the expertise, bring it in. Don't have just one person working on it. You want to rotate so that you're spreading the knowledge and you're building up the expertise across the team and not just with one person. All right. Now, these were kind of the 7 steps that will help us adopt these practices. And remember the curve that I showed you earlier, right? Remember this curve. So over time, these practices will change. When you first start, we're doing this stuff on a daily basis, except on sprint planning days and sprint review and retrospective days. So that means we're doing them 4 times per week, right? We're doing them 4 times per week. An hour of Dojo, 2 hours of mob programming, plus volunteer pairing for the rest of the days. 4 times per week when you first start, you'll probably need to do that for about a month. Then we're going to start bringing things down. Maybe we'll move from 4 times to 3 times, especially on the the learning hours, the dojos. Then we'll move down to 2 times a week, and then maybe it'll be once a week. I don't recommend you go anything lower than once a week. I think once a week is a good cadence. Once the team picks all these things up, there's always going to be learning opportunities. So this won't go down to 0, but it will likely go down to 1 hour a week of dojo once we're there. And then what I recommend with the mob programming is that it just switches from mandatory to voluntary. And by that time, like I said, the aha moment is there, and there's the working together towards a goal. The collaboration is there, that people will do it as needed and as necessary based on the current work that's ahead. So that's my recommendation. I'm gonna open it. I'm gonna be opening it up for questions in a second. I just want to recommend 2 books here. One is Accelerate. Accelerate highlights from a business perspective the benefits of all of these techniques. All right. It typically distinguishes high performers from low performance from a business perspective based on how well they're applying these techniques. And the technical coaching talks about, this is called the Salmon method, talks about some of these practices that I talked about in terms of running a daily practice session, daily learning session, and then running ensemble programming to help get these points across. All right, so I'm going to add in my contact info in the chat, and I'll open it up for questions. Anybody has any questions? Feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question.
Have you done this across multiple teams at the same time?
So typically, if I'm coaching, the way it's going to work is you're spending half a day with one team and half a day with another team. That will fill up your full day from a coaching perspective. Especially with the ensemble programming aspects, you do that per team. The dojos, you can do that across multiple teams and bring everybody together from a learning perspective. Again, it's going to be contextual, depending on the skill sets and where the teams are. But you can bring multiple teams together in a learning session, and then work with one team in the morning, one team in the afternoon when we're doing kind of ensemble programming.
So who's responsible for enforcing these steps? Is it the Scrum Master or all the team members, you know?
Yeah. Be careful on the word enforcing. The idea here is that we wanna increase the learning, awareness, and adoption of these practices, right? So as a coach, your goal is to help the organization improve. The organization wants to be able to respond to market conditions, and the way you do that is by delivering a product increment at the end of the sprint. And to deliver the product increment at the end of the sprint, you have to start adopting these practices, right? So if you're forcing this on anybody, adoption will be low, right? You have to have that aha moment that I mentioned earlier. Right? So there has to be an initiative from somebody within the organization that, yes, we need to be able to deliver product increment at the end of the sprint. And then there has to be this aha moment from the team to basically say, okay, I now get how these practices can help.
Thank you.
So how do you get client buy-in then for this?
The book that I highlighted, client buy-in now is better and better because of the DevOps movement. And because of the tie-in to business results. There's a direct tie-in, especially in the book that I highlighted, and it's coming up from the State of DevOps reports as well. There's a tie-in between these practices and how they impact the bottom line from a business perspective. All right, so that is already there. The realization that needs to kind of moving forward is the idea of it's not about tooling, right? It's not about buying tools. It's about changing behaviors and changing practices. I think that part is still kind of a bit missing. People want those things, but they see them as buying tools as opposed to changing practices. But again, from a buying perspective, you should be making a business case. We're not doing this for the sake of agility or for the sake of Scrum. We're doing them to deliver on business results. Whatever those business results are for the organization you're working with, you want to tie them to those business results. If you want to achieve those business results, here are practices or capabilities that will help us get there.
So would you say that team stability is an important factor for promoting technical excellence?
Team stability is one aspect of Scrum, meaning teams in Scrum are cross-functional and dedicated, meaning they're long-living. So before we even get to technical excellence, context switching and moving people around has it's going to delay your work. You are much better off bringing work to a team than sending the people to where the work is, purely from a team dynamics perspective, right? A team is going to grow together, learn, and become high performing by spending more and more time together and growing together, right? So that's just team dynamics. Putting technical excellence aside is a separate story. This is just about pure team dynamics.
Have you seen much pushback from any of the developers when you ask them to do the infrastructure type tasks?
That's going to vary. Some folks really get excited because it's new stuff and you're learning, and the infrastructure tasks are now around coding, right? So we refer to this as infrastructure or code. We're coding the infrastructure. It's not just working with config files. So it's new, it's different. So there's the I'm not sure I can do this, but there's also the excitement of, hey, I'm going to learn something new. Right? So depending on the person you're dealing with, that's usually less of a pushback than the other practices.
Adi, one of the things that we do deal with is, despite the fact that we may have a stable team, there are people that come in and there are people that are leaving. When I was working at Capital One in 2015, one of the things that I did was implement basically a sprint zero for the individuals coming on board, or regardless if it was 1, 2, or whatever, and just literally spend a couple hours with them explaining how this team works, what we do, and everything, and then turn them over to the team to bring them up to speed.
Yep. And now, if you're doing ensemble programming, the time it takes to bring somebody up to speed is greatly reduced because they're there. In ensemble programming, we're switching very quickly, so they're going to get a chance to get their hands dirty with the code. Plus, they're going to kind of learn how the team operates. They're going to learn team norms. They're going to learn about the team's working agreements. They're going to learn where things are in the code. So it's the same idea that you're trying to do, but it's not necessarily a separate sprint. You're throwing them in, but they're not, we're not throwing them into the deep end of the pool. We're throwing them into the shallow end of the pool with a team around them to help them get up to speed and get acquainted with the code base, the team members, the culture, the team norms, and so forth. So there's a big impact when we do that. I
agree wholeheartedly. The whole idea behind essentially, like I said, the sprint zero that I would do with new people coming onto the team is so they understood how the team worked, and so that they'd be ready to go ahead and dive in, and then let the team help them come up to speed and have the different practices help them come up to speed.
Yep, absolutely.
So for non-technical Agile coaches, Scrum masters, and you're facing a situation where developers or even technical leadership may be skeptical of these practices, what do you recommend? How do you handle that situation?
Off the top of my head, from a book recommendation perspective, the Phoenix Project and the book that I just recommended, there's a few links popping up in the chat. Thanks for whoever's adding those. Those are awesome resources to start having those conversations. And like I said, it ties business goals, business achievements to IT capabilities, directly linking how strong IT organizations are directly impacting the bottom line of business organizations. So that is where you want to start this conversation with kind of business stakeholders, IT stakeholders. The other conversation is with the development team, right? With the getting the team on board, and that has to start with this kind of aha moment that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you don't have the skill sets, you can work towards the definition of done. You can start working towards setting up sprint goals. For the other activities, you're going to need kind of a champion that's going to work with you, and that champion is most likely not going to be the tech lead. It's more likely going to be somebody that just joined the organization from somewhere else, and has seen some of these practices, or somebody earlier in their career and kind of is excited to try something new. That's typically what I've seen from that perspective.
Great, thank you.
All right. Awesome. Any other questions?
Adam asked a question in the chat, and I think I know the answer, but I'll go ahead and ask it. Is there a material difference between ensemble programming and mob programming, or are we just trying to avoid using the word mob?
Yep, that's pretty much what it is. The word, the ensemble, is more describing a group of people. You might think of a set of musicians or an orchestra working together, whereas the mob has might have some negative connotations with it, but it's exactly the same thing. We're just going with a more pleasant description.
Okay.
Trying to make things less extreme, right? Well, the word extreme programming got a lot of pushback because it was extreme. So we're trying to use language that might improve adoptions. Let's put it this way.
I've definitely encountered the quizzical look using the term mob programming, particularly on federal contracts.
Right. So that's like I said, when extreme programming came up, people said, "Oh, that's too extreme. It's not for us." Even though the practices behind them are really great practices, maybe the word that was used was not the best word to improve adoption. So.
Excuse me, sorry. Another sort of pushback I've gotten, and again, I'm mostly in the federal space, is if the development team doesn't feel the safety to not be a feature factory at the behest of the project management office, then they're going to push back against some of these practices that, as you said early on, that are counterintuitive. That are not sort of that Fram oil filter dating myself. Pay me now or pay me later, but eventually you're going to pay me, and you're better off taking some of these technical practices, figuring them out, so that these problems that we will encounter if we don't occur down the road. So that's an opinion expression on my part.
I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, it's just a thing that I've encountered.
Yeah.
Development teams that are stuck in feature factories and don't have the political clout or the safety to say, hey, we'd like to do this because we feel that in 2 sprints from now we'll be rolling along much better if we don't spend this first sprint trying to crank out features. And then 2 sprints later, looking back and going, oh, look, we haven't cranked out any features because we didn't take the practices into account.
Two things I'll bring up here. The graph that I showed you needs to make this transparent. That this is how we're going to spend our time, right? It's not just pushing out features. Within a sprint, we split up our time across these 3 areas. Now that's one, and then 2, if we really drive things via goals, which is what we're supposed to be doing in Scrum, that the features, the focus on pushing out features will kind of become less and less the focus here. And the focus is, are we delivering on our goals? Remember, all of these problems arise because we work, and don't necessarily deliver something usable. We're just delivering outputs, right? We always talk about outcomes versus outputs. So once we start delivering outcomes, a lot of this pressure kind of gets alleviated. That's been my experience. But those concerns that you bring up are valid concerns. All right. So I see somebody put in a John Gotti development. Brian, yeah. Maybe. Awesome. Any other questions?
You've mentioned in one of your slides the importance of having a sprint goal.
Yes.
Is it just for the team to be clear in which direction they're heading, or I'm not sure why? Other than that, what could be its importance?
Yes. So the idea is that we're building a product, and each sprint is getting us one step closer to that product. So it ties directly with the notion of building things iteratively and incrementally, right? So you have a product goal, higher level vision of what you're doing, and each sprint goal is getting us one step closer to that product goal. So we're gonna build a product increment that is gonna get us one step closer, right? So once you do that, of course, the benefit is that the team is collaborating together, and we're now working on a cohesive set of items that are moving us all in the same direction, versus just working on random things that don't necessarily deliver any value. All right, so it has less to do with any of the technical practices that I focused on here, and more to do with getting everybody to start collaborating together and move in the right direction, so that what we're delivering is bringing us one step closer to whatever product we're trying to build. Remember, when we're building iteratively and incrementally, each sprint, we're delivering the product plus adding a few things on top of it. If you don't have a goal, then you're probably just working on random things that when you reach the end of the sprint, these random things don't do anything on their own. We're just busy building stuff without necessarily delivering any value.
And I guess the sprint goal kind of ties into the PI goals or objectives.
Yes, you have to have a higher level objective. Typically in Scrum, we refer to that as the vision or product goal, and each sprint goal ties into those.
Thank you.
All right. Now you mentioned Smita, PI goal. So my guess is you're doing safe. If you're doing safe, what's the right word here? By default, safe has this notion of build, then deliver something. So they don't necessarily advocate the delivery of a product increment at the end of the sprint. You have several sprints before you deliver the product increment. So the safe term product increment is different than the Scrum term product increment, and that might create confusion. All right. In Scrum, the product increment is a working software that we deliver at the end of every sprint. The output of every sprint is a working product increment. In Safe, we might plan that out across multiple sprints.
Well, that could also be addressed by the fact that with Safe, they go ahead and use features.
Yeah.
And what could be the result of API is essentially a completion of a number of features.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that build, and then release at the end, because that is exactly what we are doing. And, you know, when I saw that slide, the question came to my mind, are we doing the right thing or are we doing the wrong thing?
It's not necessarily about right or wrong. It's, you know, Scrum takes that approach, which is at the end of the sprint, you have what the product increment is, whatever you've delivered before plus something new. And then Safe, you know, reinterpreted it a different way and set things up between teams that kind of creates these dependencies that we are trying to get rid of and remove. Whereas when you're trying to do it with Safe, that Safe manages those dependencies as opposed to trying to remove them. It just keeps them and manages them as opposed to removing them. Awesome.
Right, Fadi, I'm not going to be shy. So, Smita, I want to just respond to like why sprint goals are important. And to me, Fadi, this is why it's consistent with your talk today, is technical excellence has to do with craftsmanship. And so if your team members don't know how their work attaches to the larger product ownership and their craftsmanship of it, then they kind of fall into what someone else kind of said, a factory, a feature factory. And so I've found it really helpful with teams to make sure they understand how their ticket might associate with a sprint goal, it might associate with something larger, to keep them in mind that like there's a larger end goal in mind.
It's a great way to put it, Adam. You know, empathy is a whole different idea here, but that's a key driver. If you ask a team member what are they working on, and they can only put it in the context of their little task and cannot tie that task to the end user, how this will impact or help the end user, then there's a break in the chain between the customer and the person building the product. And what we try to do in Scrum is bring the customer and the team close to each other, so that you have that empathy and you know that I'm not just building a widget, I'm solving a business problem. And having that tie-in that Adam just mentioned is absolutely key to create that sense of empathy, which in turn makes the work you're doing more enjoyable and creates a motivated team that is, you know, happy to show up to work every day. Right? So absolutely. All right.
Well, thank you. It was a great presentation, Fadi.
Absolutely. Excellent topic. Well
Great.
chosen.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Glad you all enjoyed it. Happy Monday. Enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.